Thank you.
Hi Shrishtee. What brings you to this conference?
So back in India, I work with an organization called Kalpavriksh. We are an environment action group. We are associated with the group on Environmental Justice Atlas based in Barcelona. So part of that research, we find that a lot of Indian principles and values that we believe in are very closely connected to the degrowth concept of commons, conviviality, and things like that. So it was interesting to explore those linkages of North and global, North, South, global North and global South. And so that brings me here.
What in your mind does a degrowth future look like? Can you paint us a little picture, maybe linked with some of the principles from India? But what does the future look like?
I'm not sure what it looks like, but I can say what I want it to look like. I think degrowth concept is very Europe-centric, and it doesn't really have a lot of other communities or other cultures understanding. And I think it can become more holistic because it has some strong principles and linkages with a lot of practices that the indigenous communities have. So I think if it becomes more holistic, which we are actually trying to do in this degrowth conference, of getting the alternative confluences together, and also having the North and South dialogue. So I think there are steps, but I want it to be more holistic in terms of the conception and the idea.
And in that, let's say we get that confluence together and those narratives together. With that, what does the future look and feel and smell like? Maybe even, what does eating look like, or what does work look like? Is there any kind of element of the world that you can envision?
Yeah, I think it will be different because the way vegetarianism is seen in Europe, it's very different in India, because a lot of communities who are dependent, say indigenous communities who are dependent on forest, they depend on eating wild animals. So propagating vegetarianism in that part of in that part of the country would be very authoritative. So principles will have to evolve and will have to look very different, and not something that's very centric to one part of the world. So then, and the idea of degrowth, the word itself maybe doesn't apply to the Indian context, because the economy doesn't really require to degrow. I mean, there's a very different concept, say the concept of Swaraj. So it becomes a very different sort of a concept. Maybe you'll need a new word if you want to really come out of a global principle. But everything connected to degrowth may, like the Rojava presentation, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything will be connected. There could be principles talking to each other, but they might not speak in a way that maybe degrowth is imagining. But it will have those, I think it should have those spaces that it can accept the various principles and contexts that have very different belief systems and realities and histories.
Okay. And just a final question. Is there something like a practice that you have that is kind of under the umbrella of degrowth? So, if someone was new to degrowth, what does like the first step, or what does something achievable in practicing degrowth look like?
That's a very difficult one. I think personally, for me, it's very important, and it comes from my understanding of the Indian context and Indian movements and practices, is to create your own spaces a little more what you're trying to talk about. I mean, your spaces should reflect what you are propagating in the outside world. So if you're talking about radical direct democracy, in your university spaces, in your NGOs, in your work spaces, how does that operate? what do you mean by radical democracy, or what do you mean by gender inclusion in that way. So I think in those practices it becomes, and not just your spaces, then it also applies to individually. So being conscious of whatever you do or perform, or the way you operate in the world. So I think I can't claim that I do even 90% of it, but I've become more conscious of things like what is my consumption, how active I am in looking at various caste issues in India, because I was for a very long time really blind to a lot of things. So I think also when I go out and buy plastic bottles without thinking what it means. So it's just like looking at my own consumption patterns, my own behavior, and being a little more empathetic to things.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.